to the Coming to the Table training session for August of 2020. This month's session is being led by Crixell Shell. She's the Assistant Executive Director at Minnesota Peacebuilding Leadership Institute and the local Coming to the Table Racial Healing Talking Circle group leader. Crixell is a cisgender African-American woman with a professional legal and technology background. She was at Minnesota's first Strategies for Trauma and Awareness and Resilience training in June 2010, and since then has been an integral part of the development of the STAR training and Coming to the Table in Minnesota. Crixell is a STAR trainer and facilitates 3 Coming to the Table gatherings per month. And so without further ado, I'm really excited to introduce Crixell.
Thank you so much, Tom. And welcome everyone. I'm so excited to be with you all this afternoon. So just to share a little bit about myself, a little bit more about myself, as Tom indicated, I am Peacebuilding's Assistant Executive Director. Our local Coming to the Table chapter has been growing, which is really exciting for us. We've started a third monthly group, which is great. Let's see, before we get started, I just want to let folks know that if you need to, you can feel free to use chat at any time during the session. And then also, as Tom indicated, we will be utilizing breakout rooms and a couple of other features that I'll talk about when we need them, okay? So without further ado, I'm gonna go ahead and start sharing my screen here. And I have a second monitor, so that's why my head's turning. So welcome to this session, this Coming to the Table learning session. We are going to be exploring the Doctrine of Discovery. What is it and why is it relevant today? This session is sponsored by the Minnesota Peacebuilding Leadership Institute and Coming to the Table. So let me just share a little bit about our organization. The Minnesota Peacebuilding Leadership Institute was founded by our executive director, Dr. Donna Minter. And our mission is to instigate, train, and support racially, sexually, culturally, ethnically, religiously, and economically diverse individuals and organizations to become trauma-informed, resilience-oriented, and restorative justice-focused, empowering communities in Minnesota, in the United States, and around the world. We do this by holding trainings related to psychological trauma, restorative justice, self-care, and resilience, and we also do custom trainings. We also provide free community events like the 3 monthly Coming to the Table gatherings and a monthly film series where we show social justice films and have a facilitated discussion afterwards. And since 2010, we've trained over 4,000 people in Minnesota primarily, however, beyond as well. So now I'd just like to invite you all to open your chat and share on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you know about the Doctrine of Discovery? So 1 is nothing and 10 is a lot. So I'll just give you a moment to do that. And here are our learning objectives today. So we are going to be defining the Doctrine of Discovery, exploring feudalism in medieval Europe, discover connections between the Doctrine of Discovery and the legacy of enslavement in the United States, and then discuss the impacts today. So before we get started, I'd like to invite you to take a few breaths together. We call these peace-building pauses. Peace-building pauses are ways to ground ourselves so that when we are discussing topics like this and our body becomes activated, we can regulate ourselves again. So I'll invite you all to take a few deep breaths together. The video will tell you when to breathe in and breathe out, okay? Breathe in, breathe out. Perfect. All right. So in many historical contexts, colonization is referred to as settling, but it is nothing of the sort. Colonization is deeply unsettling. It disrupts the cultural identity and sense of belonging of those being colonized. It then attempts to separate them from their core values and beliefs, to break them to the will of the colonizer. Then it forcibly imposes its own values and ideologies onto those being colonized. When those subjected to colonization begin to assimilate to the ways of the oppressor, they begin to oppress others, both within and outside of their group. This expands the influence of the oppressor and further erodes the will of the people to fight their own freedom. And Sherry Mitchell said that she is an indigenous woman, author and attorney, and she wrote Sacred Instructions, Indigenous Wisdom for Living Spirit-Based Change. I will provide a follow-up email that includes any of the resources that I used today. So don't worry if you if you'd like to read the book. All right, so what is the Doctrine of Discovery? Doctrine of Discovery is a set of Papal Bulls that was issued between 1455 and 1493. It provided Christian European nations the authority to explore and conquer any non-Christian lands and people for the benefit of the discovering nation in Christianity. Newly discovered lands were to be conquered and any resources used in the name of Christianity. Indigenous people had to convert to Christianity, or their lives were threatened. They could be killed or enslaved. Indigenous communities were stripped of their own human rights, the right to live independently, govern themselves, engage in commerce, etc. Christian Europeans traveled around the world and conquered lands in the name of their leaders, countries, and Christianity. So now let's take a look at a video. It's about 11 minutes long, and this is going to further unpack the Doctrine of Discovery and provide some more historical context around it.
What do papal bulls, edicts from the Pope, from 1455 and 1493 have to do with the history of the United States? These edicts define something we call the Doctrine of Discovery. Approximately 555 years after these edicts from the Pope, why did the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues declare this Doctrine of Discovery, quote, the foundation of the violation of indigenous peoples' human rights, end quote? For most Americans, the answers to these questions take us on an uncharted journey into the rough waters of our nation's past. Are you braced for possible seasickness? Hi, I'm Tom Army, and this is United States History Online. So what was this Doctrine of Discovery? In the 15th century, Portugal began a crusade of expansion into North Africa. King Alfonso V sought the moral authority of the Church for his quest for a land-grabbing monopoly. Pope Nicholas V responded to the king in an encyclical he titled Dum Diversas, which granted Alfonso the right to claim and conquer land in North and West Africa, plus the right to capture and vanquish Saracens, who were Muslims, and pagans, and consign them to, quote, perpetual servitude, end quote. 40 years later, Pope Alexander VI, the last Spanish pope, issued a similar papal bull entitled Inter Cetera, granting Christopher Columbus the right to claim the Western Hemisphere for Catholic Spain. Pope Alexander VI gave Spain the exclusive right to discover, possess, and trade all lands west of a demarcation line 100 leagues west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands. indigenous people on those lands had only a right of occupancy, and even that right could be abolished. The doctrine of discovery became the legal justification of all European and eventually of all American land claims in this hemisphere. Indeed, in 1792, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson declared the doctrine of discovery would carry over from Great Britain's colonizing authority to the new United States government. However, this doctrine would soon be challenged legally in the early 19th century, and this challenge would compel the United States Supreme Court to rule on the veracity of this doctrine. Do you think this old concept from the time of Columbus could stand up when applied to evolving conditions in the New World? The answer may surprise you. The tangled story goes something like this. In 1773 and 1775, future Supreme Court Justice Thomas Johnson, the first justice appointed after the original 6 justices, purchased through the Illinois Wabash Company a vast swath of land from the Native American Piankashaw tribes. Subsequent to Johnson's purchase, William McIntosh, a fur trader and treasurer of the Indiana Territory, plus apparently a confidence man, claimed to own 11,560 acres along the Wabash River. He claimed to have acquired much of this acreage from land patents issued to him by the United States federal government. Historians question the legitimacy of the manner McIntosh acquired all of this property. He certainly had important connections with land speculators, including William Henry Harrison, governor of the Indiana Territory and future president of the United States. Eventually, these two men had a falling out. Harrison sued McIntosh for libel in 1805 and won a $400 settlement. McIntosh seemed to develop many enemies along his path. When Johnson's son inherited the justice's property, he discovered that William McIntosh claimed to own the same property. Joshua Johnson, the son, brought an action of ejectment, which is a civil action to recover possession of title, against McIntosh in the United States District Court for the District of Illinois. He contended that Johnson's claim of title was superior to the McIntosh claim because Thomas Johnson's purchase had preceded the McIntosh claim. But the district court dismissed the Johnson claim on the grounds that the Piankashaw had no right to transfer or sell the property. The plaintiffs, as you can imagine, appealed the decision to the United States Supreme Court. In 1823, John Marshall, writing the opinion for the Supreme Court, affirmed the dismissal of the Johnson claim. Since McIntosh acquired the land through the federal government and Johnson did not, Johnson could not prevail. The Chief Justice concluded that ownership of the land came into existence by virtue of the discovery of that land. So legally, the United States was the true owner of the property because it inherited ownership from Great Britain, the original discoverers. Tribes which occupied land were, at the moment of discovery, no longer completely sovereign and had no property rights. Only the discovering nation could take possession of the land. Marshall cited the Papal Bull Romanus Pontifex and Portugal's lands discovered along the coast of West Africa as an early example of discovery. Marshall seemingly overlooked a more recent colonial case, when he made this decision. Remember, Roger Williams had purchased his Providence plantation from the Narragansetts. Why were the Narragansetts able to sell their land? Why do you suppose Marshall ignored that precedent in making his ruling? Just 8 years later, when writing for the court in Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, 1831, Marshall reinforced his argument that tribes were not independent states but were, quote, domestic dependent nations, unquote. Marshall wrote that the relationship of the tribes to the United States resembles that of a ward to its guardian. The Doctrine of Discovery is not just 19th century law. In 2005, the Supreme Court cited the doctrine in City of Sherrill, New York, v. Oneida Nation. The justices said that under the Doctrine of Discovery, fee title, or ownership, to lands occupied by Indians when colonists arrived became vested in the sovereign. First, the discovering European nation, and later the original states and the United States. So what are we to make of all of this? The Johnson decision remains part of what law schools consider the anti-canon, cases that students are taught to criticize. Among these cases are Dred Scott v. Sanford, Plessy v. Ferguson, Lochner v. New York, and Korematsu v. United States. And over time, all of those have been overturned, except Johnson. The Doctrine of Discovery is still the law. The legal history of the United States is connected intrinsically to the development of our civilization and to our social construction. The law makes a statement about our values and our principles as a nation. Justice is blind. Yet do lawmakers try to represent everyone in a society when they fashion the law? Or do we use the law as a tool to favor one group over another in the name of equality and fairness? When you and I recognize an injustice, do we work to change the law? Do our laws protect the intrinsic dignity of everyone? In 2016, 500 clergy denounced the Doctrine of Discovery at the Standing Rock pipeline protests. Other groups from around the country have also called for the renunciation of the doctrine. One law professor said, the Doctrine of Discovery was, quote, rooted in a Eurocentric view of the inferiority of the Indian people, end quote. Yet, what was established in 1455 by a pope remains the law of our land, even today.
All right, so we are going to give time in a few moments here to discuss the video but before we in breakout rooms. But before we do that, I'd like to just share a few additional points about Johnson v. McIntosh. So Johnson v. McIntosh also, in addition to discussing how people could, or European nations could go and take over and discover non-European land, there are a few other points to the case. So first discovery. The first European country to discover lands previously known to the other Europeans gained property and sovereign rights over the land. Now this created an incomplete title. Actual occupancy and current possession created a complete title, and that included building a fort or settlement and it being occupied by soldiers or settlers. Johnson v. McIntosh also established again, the European title, the sole power and authority to buy the land from the indigenous people living on that land. And native title meant that native indigenous people lost their full property rights to their land. They did retain the right to occupancy only, and they could only sell their land to that original discovery country. They lost commercial rights as well. Indigenous folks lost the right to free trade and sovereign powers. They lost the right to do with their land as they pleased, because Europeans, if they didn't understand how the lands were being used or approve of how the lands were being used, they were considered empty and available to be claimed. People that were not Christian didn't possess the same human and natural law rights to land or themselves. And Europeans had a very narrow view of what civilization was. And only civilizations that applied their values were respected. So they actually exercised guardianship over indigenous people. And then finally, they had permission to create conquest or just wars. And so these are some of the rights and dehumanizing laws that came out of that 1823 court case, Johnson v. McIntosh. So next, we're going to give you the opportunity to go into breakout rooms and discuss what we've talked about so far with the Doctrine of Discovery. And Tom is going to break you out into breakout rooms of like 3 or 4, and it'll depend on how many people have actually signed on today. The group size will. But while you're in breakout rooms, we invite you to share your name and your pronouns, your local coming to the table group location, revisit that Doctrine of Discovery scale that you put in chat, and just share what your number was. And then briefly share your thoughts and feelings about the Doctrine of Discovery. And finally, designate a spokesperson to share themes that your group comes up with. And after you come back out from breakout rooms, we'll hear from a few of the groups about those themes. So Tom, I am gonna stop sharing now and invite you to give folks, let's see, about 10 minutes in the first breakout room. So you'll have 10 minutes, and then you'll come back after that, okay? All right, welcome back, everyone. I am going to invite a couple of groups to share the themes from their discussion. So if you all did pick a spokesperson, which I realize we didn't, and I am leading the session, how did that happen? But if you did, spokespeople, please go ahead and use the participants button in the panel that slides out. There's a raise your hand button. Go ahead and raise your hand, and I will call on you, and you can briefly share. And if anyone from my group wants to share, you can feel free. Susan, I see your hand. Would you like to share? And there are so many people on the call. I can't see your face, Susan, so I can't hear if you're talking or not.
Unmute, that will help. How about now?
We can hear you, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, we all had a low level of awareness around this doctrine, and a couple of us identified feeling disheartened by this, feeling like we've been living a lie. And also one person spoke about how the church was used to kind of incorporate this doctrine into society, but it also sounds like maybe the church is the one that used this doctrine to, so not sure about the chicken or the egg there, which came first. And of course it was decided I would speak like 15 seconds left with the group. So if anybody else in the group wants to say something about what we talked about, please do. But that's what I can remember.
Thank you, Susan. I see Richard's hand. Richard, would you like to share?
Yeah, say we were just at the point where we were trying to kind of provide a summary of what should the leader say about the time that we decided I'd be the leader.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of shooting in the dark. Our level of knowledge was basically 1 to 1.2 or something. I don't know. Nobody really knew much about the doctrine of discovery. And we thought about the idea that the whole doctrine is a complete usurpation of rights, because who gave the Pope the right to issue any such doctrine? And someone raised the question about the Indian tribes possibly being able to assert a claim, overturning all of the doctrine of discovery, because it's illegitimate from the very beginning. And that's an interesting question, because it means that no title to any land in the U.S. or in the Western world is really legitimate. So it's a pretty far-reaching concept, and we didn't get any further than that, speculating about that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We'll take a couple more. So I see Gigi's hand. Gigi, would you like to share?
Hi, I'm Gigi in Los Angeles. My group consisted of myself, Karen Gastonia in North Carolina, Anne, I forget your last name, also in North Carolina, but they don't know each other though. And Ruby Grad from Portland. The other ladies seemed to all have some awareness. I had none. We were appalled and mortified. Ruby talked about, she wasn't surprised. She knew about the doctrine, but she didn't know about the Papal Bulls. And she, was disappointed that the first Supreme Court case between two white men would patronize Native peoples and not recognize their ownership. It's everything you guys said. Anne had traveled to Black Hills with Zen peacemakers and heard a lot of stories about the treatment of Native Americans from themselves and from the descendants. And as further evidence that the Catholic Church not on the side of human rights. I'm sorry for Catholics out there, but yeah, that's all I got.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Gigi. And James is going to be our last share. Julie, I see your hand. And if you'd like to share the next time, I will make sure I call on you first, okay? I just want to be a good steward of our time together. James, would you like to quickly share?
Thank you. Hi, I'm James in Gilroy, California. Robin and Becca and I were in the breakout room. Emily tried to join us, but froze up. So the three of us all had a fair grasp of the doctrine of discovery, knew about it at least, not necessarily the particulars, but once that was all explained, we were all expressed horrified. This is simply another example of might makes right. The laws are written for the benefit of a few. Our country was built on stolen capital, the land taken from the indigenous people, and on stolen labor, the enslaved persons brought to this country. And that's what we came up with. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for spending time exploring this in your groups. Now, I want to just kind of share with you all where we're going to go now. So now we're going to head even further back in time to medieval Europe, because a couple of you expressed, where did the Pope get this authority? How did this come about? I had those same exact questions, and that's why I just sort of kept digging. So I'm going to show you all a video. It's short, it's about 4.5 minutes or so, about feudalism in Europe, and we're going to take a walk back. Okay, so this is like I said, this is a short video, about 4.5 minutes, about feudalism in medieval Europe. And we are going to do a little recap after the video plays. So.
This is a short video to explain the basics of feudalism in medieval Europe. Feudalism was a political and economic system during the Middle Ages from around the 8th century to the 15th century AD, so it was a system that lasted for many hundreds of years. Feudalism involved 4 levels of society. The king was at the top as he was the leader of the entire kingdom. Beneath him were the feudal lords, also known as nobles or barons, and these were the wealthiest landowners. Following the lords were knights or vassals, and their role was of the fighting warrior, who usually battled on horseback. Finally, on the bottom of society were the peasants or serfs. Peasants were farmers who worked the land, tending to crops and animals. They were the poorest members of the medieval world, but made up the biggest majority of the population. In these 4 social levels, feudalism worked through an exchange of land for protection, money, or food. Let's have a look at this in more detail. In the early Middle Ages, Europe was very unstable due to wars and invasions. The kings were quite weak and struggled to rule their entire kingdom by themselves. The system of feudalism arose as a matter of security for these European kings who decided it would be best to divide their land up so that they did not have to look after such a large area alone. If they strengthened their kingdom, it would then be harder for foreign people to invade. In the feudal system, the king would keep a share of the land for himself. This would be used for his palace and hunting forest, for example. The rest of the kingdom was then divided between noblemen who had been loyal to the king. The size of the land they received would depend on their personal ties with the king and the status of their family. Those lords would then keep some of the land for themselves and divide the rest up between knights of their choosing. In turn, the knights would give some of their portion of the kingdom to peasants who became serfs who were tied to the land and were not free to leave. Of course, these kings, nobles and knights were not giving away their land for no reason. As I said earlier, feudalism was based on an exchange of land for protection, money and food. Looking at this flowchart, you can see on the right-hand side the granting of land to people of a lower social status, as I've just explained. But on the left-hand side, you can see what is being exchanged for this giving of land. On the very bottom of society, the peasants would work growing food and tending to animals. They were the backbone of society, as all the food they grew was not just for themselves and their families, it would actually feed the entire kingdom. So the knights would give land to peasants so that they had farming area to grow this food, and in return the knights would protect the peasants. This was the exchange of land for labour. Next up on the scale, we can see that knights were given land by the nobles on the condition that the knights would be loyal to the lords and fight in battles when needed. This again was an exchange of land for labour. On the top of the scale, the nobles were given land by the king so that they would provide these knights to the king. The role of the nobles was to build up an army, be loyal and give money to the king, and this is what they had to do in exchange for their land. So the feudal system was quite beneficial to the king at the top. All he had to do was share some of his land, and in return he would receive food, military protection, money and knights. This strengthened the kingdom and allowed him to remain in power. To summarise what we have learnt, Europe in the early Middle Ages was weak and under threat from foreign invasion. Kings needed to share their lands among their people to lessen their responsibility, and so the feudal system was established. The order of society was the king at the top, then the nobility, followed by the knights, then the peasants on the bottom. The system was based on an exchange of land for money, loyalty, protection and food. This helped to secure Europe.
All right, so let's recap feudalism in medieval Europe. So the king owned the land. He needed others to work, maintain, and protect him and his land. Nobles were directly under the king. They were often related to the king or had some type of connection that made them powerful. and the king provided them land in exchange for loyalty. And then under the nobles, there were knights. Nobles provided knights land in exchange for protection and military service. And then there were peasants. Peasants lived and worked the land and provided food for the kingdom. And then finally, the Catholic Church became the most powerful institution in the medieval period. Kings, queens, and other leaders derived much of their power from alliances with and protection of the church. Also, I'd like to point out that in between 1347 and 1350, the bubonic plague came through medieval Europe, and it killed millions of people. And so as we're considering what would make folks decide, oh, we can go and travel and take, you know, this huge risk and come over to exploring and discovering new lands, I think it's important for us to remember that the majority of people in medieval Europe were peasants. They were dealing with the collective trauma of the bubonic plague, and they had very little power because of the system of the king, the nobles, and the knights. And so I want to give us the opportunity to now discuss feudalism in medieval Europe, and we'll take about 5 minutes this time in our breakout rooms. And so I'd like you to answer, what role did feudalism in medieval Europe have on indigenous communities in the 15th and 18th century, and what impact does it play in our society today? And then if there's time, share any additional discoveries or connections. And if you didn't decide on a spokesperson, you can go ahead and do that now during this breakout session. Okay. So now let's hear from a couple of groups what you all discussed in terms of feudalism in medieval Europe and the impacts on the indigenous people that they encountered because of the Doctrine of Discovery. And when I see those hands, I know Julie, if you put your hand up, I'll call on you first. And I see Edith's hand. Edith, would you like to share?
Hi, this is Edith. I don't want to jump in front of Julie. I'll make sure she gets her time.
Yes, Julie's hand is now up.
I wanted to point out from, oh, should Julie go first then?
No, go ahead. I'll call on Julie next. I just want Julie to know I see your hand.
Okay. Well, we discussed, I wanted to point out from the last, discussion about what we knew about the Doctrine of Discovery, that I'm a lawyer and I did not know the Doctrine of Discovery. I went to law school 20-something years ago. I don't know if there are other lawyers who maybe have the same experience that I have, but I think we were just taught kind of it's a given that if you're the conqueror, then you get the land and you get to make up the rules about the land. And I didn't know that there was actually a legal doctrine that spelled all that out. So that was news to me. And we discussed that we could see the connection from the feudal system to our current system of government, in that we still have the concept of the sovereign. We don't really go around saying that in normal communications, but as a legal matter, there's still that concept. And that there's the idea that the sovereign really owns everything, and that everyone else has rights as the sovereign sees fit. It's not quite as bad as it was in the feudal system. You have a lot more rights than you did in the feudal system to the underlying land, but obviously we have used that concept definitely to the disadvantage of the indigenous people who were here before the Europeans. I think, so tribal people do not have the same rights that that whites have, what European whites have. And so that doctrine is definitely translated into the New World.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you, Edith. Julie, would you like to share?
So one of us, I think it was Deborah, pointed out that she realized that the peasants and the serfs did not have hunting rights, and she was wondering when those hunting rights had disappeared. And I just wanted to say that from my point of view about the Doctrine of Discovery, that the Quakers in New York in 2012 said that they repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery. So I've learned a little bit more about it. And I have a sense, it's not confirmed, I don't have it in my notes here, but I think that the indigenous people actually went to the Vatican at one point recently and had a fruitless conversation with somebody there on the Doctrine of Discovery. I'll have to Google it again.
Please do. And if you find anything, I would love to have that resource.
Okay.
Yeah.
And before that, I had my notes said that Aaron Lyons in New York State, an indigenous elder, said that in 2001, I think it was, that they felt that the Oneida Nation felt that the Doctrine of Discovery did nothing for them. Mm-hmm. So he did speak about that. There's a YouTube under Aaron Lyons, mm-hmm. Lyons, and his first name is Oren.
Perfect. And if anyone else has any other resources, please put them in chat. It's just very helpful, and there's so much out there that when we come across something that can be helpful, it's great to share it. So thank you in advance for anyone who's able to do that. And so we're going to kind of walk through how this all connects to the legacy of slavery in this country, including what is race and how did it come about. So, before we shift there, I do want to just let folks know. So in medieval Europe, no, peasants did not have the ability to own their own land. They didn't have the ability to hunt on the land. They essentially had to get permission for everything. And that was one of the big draws for people to make that perilous journey from Europe to wherever their destination was, where they became colonizers. It was the idea that they could gain some independence. And being a land-owning male back then was paramount. That's how you had rights. And so when the opportunity came, people often took it, but then some people were also forced to come over here as well. So this next video, it's the origin of race. We're going to kind of walk through where did race come from and how was it connected, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and share again. Okay, and this video is about 9 minutes.
Did you know that race was not always considered a biological or genetic category? So how did we come to understand it that way today? We all have a working definition of race. Whether you kind of understand it, hate it, claim not to see it, or study it, hint, hint, cough, cough, that's me, it still plays a role in all of our daily lives. From the way that people interact to the places they live and stereotypes they face, race is still a determining factor in our social structures, both inside and outside of the US. But full disclosure, I do a lot of US history, so this is a US specific video about race, since these histories operate differently across various contexts. Okay, so let's get started by asking, what were some of the earliest definitions of race? Well, before we started thinking of race along the lines of biology, genetics, or phenotype, aka physical appearance, did you know that it was largely considered a category of kinship or group affiliation? In the 16th century, we started to see the use of the word race in English, but it isn't attributed to physical traits or behavior. It meant quite literally that you were all members of the same household, group, or shared a common ancestor. But when did race shift to being less about kinship groups to sounding more complicated than the lyrics to I'm My Own Grandpa? Well, we can see that starting in the colonial era. And that brings us to our second question. Why did we see the shift in the idea of race in the 17th and 18th century? The answer to this question is firmly rooted in two things: the rise of global capitalism that was backed by slavery and colonialism, and a period of theorizations in Europe known as the Enlightenment. When the Spanish began the colonization of the Caribbean and later Latin America after 1492, they looked to native populations to mine silver and gold under brutal working conditions. They set about enslaving, attacking, and murdering those who didn't comply. Thousands of native people died as a result of overwork, genocide, or because they were exposed to new diseases brought over with the Spanish settlers. And when England established its first successful long-term colonies in North America in Virginia in 1607, they looked to mirror this pattern of enslavement with native people, while also seeking copious amounts of silver and gold. But they had limited success with this route because, one, Virginia wasn't exactly rich in gold, and two, native populations were able to resist the efforts of early settlers through fighting back or escaping and blending into adjacent native groups. English settlers still wanted to make money off of this venture, so they began to look to alternative ways of making Virginia profitable, and that came in the form of tobacco. But a major problem with growing tobacco is that it requires a ton of labor, and the laborers needed the agricultural skills to turn the crop into cash. Because they had already met with sustained resistance from native populations, English settlers looked to other potential labor sources: enslaved Africans and indentured British laborers. There are some important distinctions to make between these two groups. First, indenture was a contractual agreement with fixed terms that varied widely. Some indentured servants were brought to the colonies against their will, either as a punishment or because they were children. Terms of these contracts were often very exploitative, but many came willingly in exchange for their passage to the new colonies. And many of these indentured servants finished the terms of their contracts and began lives as property owners. Enslavement of Africans was a different category of labor from indenture, because one, slavery was for life, not for a fixed term or a number of years. Two, slaves were not considered human. Three, it was not a contract because it takes two consenting humans to enter into a contract. And four, slave laws were enacted codifying hereditary slavery, meaning that if you were enslaved and had children, then those children would also remain in slavery. With the expansion of this system, there was understandably some resistance, even from Europeans. So in order to continue to justify slavery, we start to see the pseudoscience of race emerge that connected physical features, behavior, and legal rights right around the 18th century when colonial use of slaves was expanding. Anthropologist Audrey Smedley notes that scientific ideas about physical appearance and racial difference in the 18th century were largely folk ideas used to justify already existent social norms. So as a result of a desire to perpetuate systems of exploitation, more and more distinctions were made about the supposed differences amongst races, primarily the differences of Black people from their white counterparts. This evolution of race became more concretized after social structures of slavery were in place and not before, and was solidified by the Enlightenment. Which brings us to our third question. How did the Enlightenment impact definitions of race? The Enlightenment was a period of primarily European thought and ideological development that saw the emergence of some key concepts concepts that tie back into today's discussion. First, there was a push in scientific communities to categorize the natural world using reason and creating elaborate hierarchical systems that emphasize the similarities between different species and subgroups and the inherent differences amongst others, and race was fitted into this same mold. As European theorists looked to classify the world into scientific groupings, physical markers that were already established social norms through enslavement and genocide were ways that they sought to prove that this was the natural order and not a social construction. For example, Thomas Jefferson, who was a proponent of concepts like individual liberty and freedom for white men, or those he considered his peers, also made claims that black slaves required less sleep than their European counterparts to justify excruciatingly long and inhumane work hours. And Samuel Cartwright, who falsely claimed that drapetomania was a mental defect that caused enslaved black people to run away from slavery, as if wanting to escape a lifetime of enslavement was illogical. The Enlightenment formulation of history also played a crucial role in the development of social ideologies of race. Kant, Hegel, and other philosophers of their day claimed that certain racial groups stood outside of history or had no history, and this included all groups that they considered non-white or outside of European ideals of modernity. This meant that groups that were devoid of history and culture were inherently less valuable and therefore subordinate to other races, and they were cast as the natural sacrifices of progress. These assumptions were also codified into law in the 18th and 19th century. The first naturalization laws of the United States in 1790 limited naturalized citizenship to free white persons and excluded other groups. Children born of enslaved mothers were said to inherit the legal statuses of their mother, effectively keeping them in bondage perpetually. And Native Americans were often denied legal property rights, which helped to expedite the process of westward expansion across the North American continent. And anti-miscegenation laws were drafted in order to assure that people from different racial backgrounds did not intermarry or have children in order to protect ideals of racial purity. But these racial categorizations didn't always neatly align with skin tone. In his book, Whiteness of a Different Color, European Immigrants and the Alchemy of Race, historian Matthew Jacobson notes that in the US, white or Caucasian was not always considered a unified race composed of anyone of European descent. Whiteness was often considered exclusive to Anglo-Saxon descendants, while other European groups were broken into different ethnic categories such as Celt, Slavs, Iberics, and Hebrews, which were considered separate races from the 1840s to the early 20th century. But in the 1920s, when there was a stemming of immigration from Europe, these different races were subsumed into one category called whiteness to shore up a cultural majority against other racial groups and immigrants, and this persisted throughout the 20th century. So how does it all add up? Well, race started as a marker of kinship, but then we see it shift to become less about familial inheritance and more focused on physical indicators due to the rise of Enlightenment reasoning and labor exploitation. But where does that leave us today? Well, in the past several decades, scholars have noted both an uptick in identifying with your ethnic history, for example, pride in your country or culture of origin, instead of just being white or black. But we've also seen a revival of outdated theories of race being biologically determined and attached to certain traits, like considering all people of one physical type as prone to certain behaviors. But regardless of how people identify themselves, race continues to be a complex topic of discussion and debate. With that final thought in mind, do you have any other historical points to add to the evolution of race? And how has race been used in both positive and negative contexts throughout history? Definitely be sure to check out the work cited this week, since there was a lot.
All right, I'm going to end there and just kind of recap. So the connections between the Doctrine of Discovery, legacy of slavery in the United States and today. So white supremacy and domination and expansion, the maintain and consolidating wealth and power, the dehumanization, exploitation, and control of non-white and non-Christian bodies, land ownership and governance, and voter suppression, the enslavement of African and African people in this country and mass incarceration, and then just wars, militarization of local police force to control Black, Indigenous people of color. So now I'd just like to invite you to share what new insights or discoveries you're making, and briefly share the connections you see or have experienced between the doctrine of discovery and the legacy of slavery in your community. So we have just a couple more minutes together. So I just want to hear from a couple of groups. What did you all discuss? What connections or examples did you have? Karen B., I see your hand.
Well, we were noting about the origins of the doctrine of discovery having been with the Christian church, and noting how that has also translated to our country, but which seems to be cited as primarily Christian, or or it used to be anyway. I think it's changing now. And certainly I was saying my own community it puts a lot of emphasis on Christianity. Mm-hmm. For sure. And I talked about a book I'm reading that talks about how white Christianity has promoted white supremacy in our country.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you, Karen. Would anyone else like to share? Hey, Sarah Irwin, I see your hand.
Hi, so we were talking about the time before the revolution when poor whites and poor blacks were friends, and then I think it was the British government during Bacon's Rebellion came in and made sure to change that and sort of pitted the two groups by skin color basically against each other.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Sure.
And Edith is going to be our last share.
I would just echo what Sarah just said. As we just got cut off at the end, we had started talking about that idea of using it as a way to using race as a way to divide people. Because if people ever came together and realized what they had in common, the world would have been a different place. Mm-hmm. We all discussed that the concept of race was, something we learned about, and it's never been really used in a positive way. There's not many examples I can think of where this construct of race has been used to help anyone.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Edith, it's interesting to me, and as we go through, this is a quick lesson, right? This is a quick session, and all of the things that were talked about in the video are extensively researched, and we could spend a lifetime learning about this stuff. So what I'll share though is that race has often been used to help the majority. So every so often, when white needs to have more people brought in so they can maintain the majority, as we saw in the video, new folks are welcomed in, the doors open for them. And so I think that we might be seeing that a little bit now in terms of white Hispanic folks. And so I've been kind of having these conversations and trying to understand the ebb and flow of the open door to whiteness. So it's really interesting. I'd encourage anyone who is curious about whiteness to go and kind of look at more resources, and I'll try to find some and put them in the follow-up email as well for the session. But it's, the way that race is used is typically to help the majority and disenfranchise the minority or people of color typically. So it's very interesting. All right, well, I just have a couple more slides. So here are our learning objectives again. We defined the doctrine of discovery, we explored feudalism in medieval Europe, We discovered connections between the Doctrine of Discovery and the legacy of enslavement in the United States, and we discussed some of the impacts that we are dealing with today. So now I give you the opportunity to revisit. How much do you feel like you know about the Doctrine of Discovery now? And go ahead and use that same scale of 1 to 10 and in chat, and kind of take note. Has your number changed at all? Do you feel like you have some information you didn't have at the beginning of this session? And then what's the next indicative step? Where do we go from here? Well, in the post-session email, there will be an evaluation. I'd really appreciate if you fill that out. It's one of the ways that I get better as a person, and also my organization understands what is working and how we can create trainings and sessions that help people, and so we'd really appreciate if you fill that out. You can attend more coming to the table groups or start your own local group if you don't have one where you are. Maybe you joined one before and then you moved. This work is needed. As Tom said, we still have lots of states with no coming to the table local groups. So I think it would enrich all of us if we were able to get more people on board. Share your experience with others. Encourage them to attend coming to the table gatherings with you. Attend peacebuilding trainings to learn more about psychological trauma, restorative justice, and resilience. And finally, I'd invite all of you to attend Luna Fest. It's a women's film festival for racial justice, equity, and transformation. It's our one fundraiser that we do for our organization a year. And this year it's on Wednesday, August 26th from 7 to 9, and we are holding it via Zoom and Vimeo. So we invite any of you to come if you'd like. And then if you would like to know more about me, our organization, you can reach out to me at Crixell at mnpeace.org, and also visit our website. All of our trainings are there. And so I just want to thank everyone for attending the session with me today. And I will reach out to anyone that reaches out to me. So if you have any questions, just let me know.
I want to thank you, Crixell, for a wonderful presentation this afternoon. It's always been amazing to me that the end of feudalism and the rise of capitalism coincides almost precisely with the launching of the Atlantic slave trade in the mid-15th century. And this just adds more and more to understanding of what history has brought us to today. We've got another learning session coming up September 27th on writing family history. We hope you'll join us then, and go to the Coming to the Table YouTube page for all of these recorded sessions. And thank you for being at the table. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.